I watched the sweep thin and die at 2307, and the bridge still expected bearings in the snow. My orders demanded early warning, but the spare kit gave me the wrong glass in the wrong envelope. I pulled a compatible tube from the secondary set and seated it with shaking care under a red lamp. When the screen returned, it came back noisier, and every mile beyond the ring felt like borrowed time. In late March 1944, the Barents Sea was still locked in winter. The war in the Arctic did not pause for the calendar. Convoys moved between Britain and the Soviet ports under a ceiling of cloud and sleet. A return convoy was forming up west of the Kola Inlet, bound for the open water and then home. German aircraft and U-boats still hunted the route. British escorts kept station in the dark, watching for periscopes, wakes, and on any small change in the sea. The operational risk was plain and measurable. If the escort screen lost early warning at night, a submarine could close unseen and a merchant could be torpedoed before the line received a turn order. The sea state made sound carry oddly, and ice made every deck task slower. Visibility came and went with the snow. At 1840, the convoy's columns were still tightening their intervals. Signal lamps blinked and vanished behind spindrift. The escorts answered with short flashes and then returned to their arcs. At 16:15, before darkness, the ship's defects book already held an awkward detail. The radar spare valve envelope was mismarked, and no one could swear what was inside. On one of the escorts, a narrow compartment under the bridge held the radar display. So the set was a surface warning radar of a common wartime pattern, built around valves and a cathode ray tube. It was not a secret weapon by 1944. It was a working tool as routine as the ship's log or the helmsman's orders. Its value came from minutes gained in darkness. The primary anchor of this story was one man's watch, a radar operator on the night shift responsible for keeping the surface picture running and reporting any contact within a fixed reporting window. His constraint was written into the standing orders. Any contact inside 8 miles was to be reported at once, with bearing and range, and the plot was to be updated every few minutes if it held steady. On a night of low visibility, those 8 miles could be the difference between a warning and an impact. He was an able seaman with a rating badge that did not impress the older branches. His hands were usually ink-stained from range notes and grease-stained from the set's covers. The bridge spoke of the radar as if it were a single eye. He knew it as a stack of boxes, cables and fragile glass, warmed by power and threatened by cold. During the afternoon, he had checked the spares locker once more. A brown envelope in the kit was tagged with a typed label. The label did not match the valve number that should have been inside. He made the entry in the defects book because the system demanded proof, not memory. That small line, written before supper, reduced the night's margin. After 2000, the ship settled into the routine of a night escort. The bridge reduced its lights. The voice pipes and sound-powered phones were tested. The lookout on the forecastle stamped his feet to keep blood moving. The radar operator brought the display up to standard brilliance and focus. A faint line swept the tube face. Sea return showed as a smear, and ship echoes sat like small bright marks on the edge of it. At 21:10, an operator on another escort reported a weak contact that faded as quickly as it came. The signal was passed along the screen, then dismissed as weather. No one could be certain. In Arctic waters, the boundary between a submarine and a snow squall was thin on a tired night. By 2200, the radar room was warm enough to fog a breath. The set's fans made a steady, dull sound. The operator checked the range scale against the nearest escort. He penciled a note on his pad, escort on starboard quarter, 3.5 miles, steady. The ship rolled. And the bright blips rode the sweep. A medium line of instruction arrived from the bridge at 22:25, clipped and practical. Maintain strict surface watch. Report immediately any contact that breaks the screen line's pattern, and expect course adjustments without notice. The operator acknowledged on the phone. The watch continued. At 23:07, the sweep line hesitated. It did not stop at once. It thinned, then brightened, then thinned again. A faint smell like hot dust came from the rear of the cabinet. The operator leaned closer. A hairline crack had appeared across the glass of a valve seated in its holder. The crack was small, but it was enough. Within seconds, the display dimmed. The sweep lost coherence. Then the screen went dark. The operator called it out immediately. "Radar off the air," he said into the sound-powered phone, careful to keep his voice level. The bridge responded without drama, but with a change in tone. Confirm. Cause? He could only answer with what he could see. Valve failure. Display out. The consequence was visible and immediate. In the radar room, the round face of the tube reflected only the operator's hands and the red glow of a lamp. On the bridge, the officer of the watch lost the only instrument that could see through the snow beyond a few hundred yards. Lookouts were told to strain harder. The helmsman was ordered to keep station by wake and shadow. At 23:10, the escort's arc was still assigned, but it had become guesswork at the edges. The official procedure for a radar defect was also routine. Try the standard checks. Replace the failed component with the proper spare. Log the defect. Inform the senior officer if the set could not be restored quickly. On paper, that was sufficient. In practice, the kit mattered. The operator opened the spares locker and took out the envelope with the typed label. He read the number under the lamp. It was the wrong type for the socket in front of him. He opened the envelope anyway. Inside was a valve of a different pattern, its pins slightly different, its glass a different length. It had been packed in error, or swapped at some earlier issue, or mislabeled in the hurry of a convoy sailing. There was no second envelope. He reported again to the bridge. Spare kit incorrect. No correct valve in envelope. The pause on the line was short. The bridge asked the next practical question. How long to restore? He did not give a false answer. Unknown. Need compatible valve. At 23:16, he turned to the second set in the compartment, a less capable unit used for training checks and as a backup display source. It had been kept as an auxiliary, not expected to carry the whole night. Its valve lineup included a part number that matched, or was close enough to match, the one that had cracked. He did not rely on memory alone. He took a small booklet from the shelf. The booklet listed valve types and the positions they served. His finger moved along the columns. The number was there, the same valve type used in an amplifier stage. Stripping a valve from a secondary unit was not written into the standing orders. It reduced redundancy. It also meant making a choice without permission, while the ship still held station in darkness. The operator hesitated for a moment, not out of fear of reprimand, but because the cost had to be weighed. If the main set stayed dead, the escort would be blind. If the auxiliary set was cannibalized, a later failure would leave nothing at all. He chose the immediate site. At 23:20, he asked the electrical artificer for help. The artificer arrived with a tool roll and a tired look. The two men worked under a red lamp. A cover was removed. A valve holder was released. Cold air rushed in when the cabinet was opened, and the warmth inside condensed on metal. The operator handled the glass with care. He wrapped it in a cloth, not wanting a slip to end the attempt. A small consequence beat followed. In the same minutes, the bridge sent a warning to the convoy by lamp. Escorts operating without radar on one unit maintain intervals strictly. Expect erratic visibility. The lamp flashes were seen by the nearest merchant. Further back, they were swallowed by snow. By 23:33, the borrowed valve was seated in the main set. Contacts were cleaned. The operator checked the pins, aligned the guide, and pressed it down without forcing. Power was applied. A faint hum returned. The sweep line reappeared, weak at first. He adjusted the brilliance. He waited for the set to stabilize, watching for the telltale flicker of a second fault. The next step was proof, not hope. A radar that came back without calibration could mislead the bridge. A wrong range mark could be worse than no range mark. At 23:38, he took a calibration card and a pencil. He asked the bridge for a known reference. The bridge replied with the range to a nearby escort by visual estimate and by station plan. He did not treat it as exact. He used it as a check. He ran a quick calibration routine. The range rings were set. The time base was checked against the internal marker. He wrote a line. 2340, cal check, ring at 2 miles, matches escort echo, slight drift on 4. That note was practical and limited. It did not claim performance beyond what he could verify. At 23:45, he reported to the bridge. Radar restored, calibration checked, some drift on longer range marks. The officer of the watch acknowledged. The bridge resumed surface reporting expectations. Lookouts were not stood down. In Arctic waters, no one relaxed because a dial lit up. After midnight, the sea darkened further. Snow thickened and then thinned. The radar picture held, but it was not as clean as before. The borrowed valve was not new. Its emission might be lower. Noise on the display was higher. And small echoes were harder to separate from sea return. The operator compensated by narrowing the range scale, then widening it again in cycles. At 0022, the sweep showed a faint, intermittent mark to port. It was not strong enough to announce as a submarine. It was strong enough to watch. He marked it on paper and called it as possible contact, bearing 310, range 6 to 7, intermittent, maybe weather. The bridge did not order an attack, it ordered a cautious adjustment. The escort edged out, changing bearing by a few degrees. Another escort was warned to cover the gap. That decision had a visible consequence. The escort's wake shifted. A merchant astern lost the familiar silhouette of the escort's stern light and had to correct by compass. At 035, a signalman on a merchant flashed a brief complaint about station keeping. Yet the escort did not answer with explanation. It held its new arc. At 105, ice began to build on the radar aerial. The operator could not see it from his compartment, but the echo pattern showed it. Returns broadened, range discrimination worsened. He asked the deck party to check the aerial and clear ice when safe. The bosun's mate replied that the forward deck was shipping green water and that clearing would have to wait for a lull. A medium line carried the reality of the Arctic into the system. The radar might be powered, but the weather could still make it lie. The operator worked the gain and sea clutter controls, trying to keep the picture usable without hiding small returns. By 140, fatigue was a factor. The operator swapped with his relief for a short break, then returned. The relief had been trained but did not know the set's temper as well. The operator stayed close, hovering near the cabinet, listening to the fan pitch, watching the sweep for any stutter. At 2:12, the phone from the bridge buzzed again. The officer wanted confirmation that the set remained stable. The operator answered with measured language. Set operating, noise higher than normal, range marks checked at short scale, no confirmed contacts. The bridge could act on that. It could not act on pride. At 2:30, a lookout report came in. A dark shape had been seen off the port bow, low and brief. The bridge turned the ship a few degrees. The operator swung the aerial and watched for a corresponding echo. He saw nothing firm. That absence was also information. It suggested either that the shape was a wave, or that any object was too small and too close to be separated in clutter. The convoy did not stop for certainty. Another consequence beat arrived at 2:47. One escort fired a short starshell pattern to illuminate a suspicious patch of sea. The pale light showed only broken water and drifting ice. The flare reflected off the snow, making the bridge wince. The convoy's columns tightened again, as if the light had pulled them inward. Before dawn, the ship's engineering officer visited the radar space. He looked at the open auxiliary set and the missing valve. He asked in a controlled voice who had authorized the cannibalization. The operator answered honestly. No authorization. Spare kit incorrect. Main set required to restore watch. The officer did not argue. No, I would at the moment. And he told the operator to record the action and to tag the borrowed valve's origin. Orders existed for a reason, but they also existed to keep ships alive. At 3:15, the operator made the paperwork real. He wrote in the defect log, main radar failed 2307 due cracked valve, spare kit mispacked, borrowed valve from auxiliary set fitted 2333, calibration check 2340, auxiliary set now incomplete. Then the wrong envelope was attached to the page with a string. In plain block letters, the valve number followed beneath it. No embellishment was added. By 3:40, the sky began to lighten at the edge. Not with sun, but with a thinning of black. The convoy was still in hostile water. Aircraft could appear at any time after first light. For that, the escorts relied on their air warning and on the discipline of lookouts. The operator's choice had preserved the surface picture, but it had also reduced the ship's backups. That was the trade he had accepted. At 4:05, a short signal arrived from the senior officer of the escort group. It requested reports of any equipment defects, especially radar, with times and remedies. The operator's bridge sent the defect entry up the chain in a concise format. The group commander needed to know which ships were blind and for how long. The visible consequence on the bridge was immediate. A second lookout was posted on the port wing, and the bosun's mate was told to sound a short whistle blast at fixed intervals to steady station keeping in snow. Merchants answered with muffled blasts, counting distance by sound when sight failed. At 4:30 the snow eased. A merchant's masthead light appeared faintly. Geralt then disappeared again. The radar picture steadied. The operator's pencil kept moving. He noted ranges on escorts, then erased and re-noted as the convoy adjusted. Routine work resumed, but the margin remained narrow. At 5:10, the earlier intermittent echo returned, stronger now but still uncertain. This time it moved in a way that suggested it was a ship's reflection from a distant merchant on the far edge of the convoy. The operator reported it with the same restraint. The bridge compared it with the convoy plan and agreed. No depth charges were wasted. That restraint mattered. In the Arctic, false alarms could drain a ship's stock and exhaust its crew. A medium line of narrative truth held the night together. The best equipment in 1944 still depended on small glass parts, paper labels, and men who could keep their judgment steady when a screen went black. The operator did not think in those terms. He thought in bearings, ranges, and the next minute. At 6 o'clock, first light came as a grey wash over the sea. The lookouts could see farther. The radar became a cross-check rather than the only sense. The escort group held its formation. No torpedoes were reported in that stretch of night. If that outcome held, it could not be assigned to one valve alone. The operator did not claim otherwise. The day brought a different test. At 9:30, the convoy shifted course to avoid an area reported to have heavy U-boat traffic. The report came from higher command based on signals intelligence and patrol sightings. The escorts adjusted their screen positions. The radar operator's set was used to keep spacing as the columns bent. But with daylight, that work looked simpler from the outside. It was not. The outer escorts had to accelerate to regain their stations on the new legs. On the display, convoy echoes stretched into long smears during the turn and then tightened again as the column settled. At 10:05, the operator inspected the failed valve again. The crack had widened slightly, as if the temperature changes had finished the break. The glass was not shattered. It was simply untrustworthy. He placed it in a padded tin and wrote, "Failed, cracked," on tape. The ship could not afford a loose piece of glass near critical circuits. At 11:20, the electrical artificer and the operator tried the auxiliary set with a substitute valve of a similar class, only as a temporary measure. It functioned, but not to standard. They left it in a standby state, not relied upon. That the ship still needed a proper replacement. That requirement would follow them to port. At midday, the escort received a short routine signal. Expect a supply rendezvous after the convoy cleared the most threatened sector and prepare equipment defect returns for the next maintenance window. Such messages were part of the system that kept the Arctic route alive. They did not mention the night's small failures. They assumed that ships would make do and report later. At 1400, a brief conference took place on the bridge. The captain, the navigator, the gunnery officer, and the engineer reviewed the defect list. Radar was one line among many. There were always defects: a motor running hot, a valve leaking, a compass lamp failing. The difference was that radar failure affected everyone at once. The engineer asked whether the operator had endangered the ship by removing a valve from the auxiliary set. The navigator asked what the alternative would have been. Captain and officers listened in silence for a moment. He asked for the log entry and the calibration note. The conference ended with a small procedural change. A handwritten valve list was taped inside the spare's lockered door, where any watchkeeper could see it under a lamp. The proof detail lay in the paper. In the defect book sat the time and the observed failure. On the page, the wrong envelope was attached and could be inspected. Beside it, the calibration note showed range marks and a short-scale check, with times. His handwriting was steady. It did not read like a man trying to impress. It read like a man trying to make a record that could be used. The captain did not offer praise in front of the whole bridge. He also did not issue a rebuke. He instructed the engineer to report the mispacked spare kit through the proper supply channel. He ordered that, until the ship received correct spares, an additional check be made of every valve envelope on board, with type numbers verified against the set's list. That was an institutional response, small and practical. On the same afternoon, the operator was told to brief the next watch section. He laid out the facts without drama. The wrong envelope was set on the table under the lamp. Next, the valve number in the booklet was indicated with a pencil. He explained where the borrowed valve had come from and how it had been tagged. The lesson was not be heroic. It was know your set and know your stores. At 1640, and as the convoy continued westward, a sharp snow squall passed across the screen. The radar picture filled with clutter. The operator adjusted again. He felt in a small way the cost of the borrowed valve. The set remained usable, but it required more attention. That attention had to be maintained for hours at a time. By 1810, evening closed in again. Evening brought the second night. Now the convoy was further from the Soviet coast, but it remained in a zone where U-boats could wait. Escorts rotated their positions, swapping arcs to keep fatigue spread. Back in the radar space, the operator returned to his station. For the moment, the borrowed valve held. He watched for any flicker. He listened for any change in fan pitch. He checked the smell of the cabinet air, a habit learned the hard way. At 19:05, the bridge-ordered blackout discipline tightened. A merchant had shown too much light on Hudson deck. The escort signalled the correction. Such small breaches were dangerous. In Arctic night, a cigarette ember could be seen for miles. A careless lamp could guide an aircraft. The radar operator noted the message only because it was part of the overall pattern of tension. A convoy was a machine. Light leaks and spare kit errors were both failures of discipline, and both could be paid for. At 20:30, an escort on the outer screen reported a sonar contact and dropped a short pattern of depth charges. The detonations carried through the water and vibrated the escort's hull. In the radar room, the sweep line wavered for a second. The operator steadied it. He did not claim that radar had found the submarine. He did not claim the charges had hit. And he recorded only the vibration and the time. 20:31. Depth charge shock. Display steady after brief flutter. A visible consequence beat followed within the convoy. Merchants altered slightly to avoid the disturbance. Station keeping became harder in darkness. One ship drifted out of line and had to be signalled back. The escort's officer of the watch kept his voice even, but the ship's motion and the distant blasts made the situation feel close. At 21:45, freezing spray turned to ice on the bridge windows. Lookouts wiped their goggles. The radar, imperfect as it was, gained value again. The operator ran the range scale out to 10 miles, then back to 5, searching for any object that did not belong. He saw the convoy's echoes and the escort's marks. Beyond them, the screen showed only weather. At 22:18, the bridge asked for a short calibration recheck. The request was not a criticism, it was caution. The operator complied. He used a known escort echo at close range. He adjusted the range marker slightly. He wrote, 22:21, recheck, 2-mile ring aligned, no change on short scale. The note was clipped, meant to be read later. After 2300, the night's earlier memory returned. The operator kept one eye on the cabinet. He knew that the borrowed valve was a point of risk. It might fail, it might drift, it might hold. He could not predict. He could only watch and record. At 23:35, a report came from the starboard lookout. A faint phosphorescent line in the water, possibly a wake. The bridge turned its attention. The operator swung the aerial and increased gain, then reduced it to avoid saturating. And a small echo appeared and then blended into sea return. He reported it as uncertain, brief bearing 070, range approximately 4, lost in clutter. The bridge did not launch an attack on that alone. It ordered the escort to edge toward the bearing and to increase speed slightly. Another escort was told to cover the gap. The consequence was physical. Speed increased. Spray rose higher. Ice formed faster. On the forecastle, the lookout's boot struck harder on the steel as he braced. The ship's motion changed the radar's sea return again. The operator compensated. It was a cycle of adjustment with no end. At 0010, after midnight again, the faint echo did not return. The bridge eased speed back. No torpedo tracks were seen. The convoy held together. The radar operator did not feel relief as a surge, and he felt it as a reduction in immediate tasks. At 1:25, the ship took a signal from the senior officer. It instructed the escorts to tighten the screen for the next hour, based on an aircraft report earlier in the evening. There was no claim of a specific submarine. There was only a warning. The operator's work intensified. He ran quick sweeps, then careful ones. He kept a pencil mark for each escort in view so that anything new would stand out. At 2:05, the radar picture showed a distinct mark outside the convoy on the port bow. It held for 2 sweeps. It moved slightly relative to the convoy. That was enough to report. The operator gave bearing and an estimated range. He did not declare it a submarine. He called it surface contact, small bearing 320, range 7 to 8. That track uncertain. The bridge responded by ordering a change of course for the escort, not the convoy. The escort moved outward to investigate. A visible consequence beat followed in minutes. The escort's searchlight remained off, but its silhouette shifted against the sea. Its wake cut a new line. The convoy's nearest merchant had to correct to avoid crossing that wake. On the screen, the contact faded. It might have been an ice flow. It might have been a breaking wave. It might have been something else. No proof could be claimed. At 2:40, the escort returned toward station. Fuel had been burned for an uncertain contact. Time had been spent. Those were costs, not tragedies. The operator recorded them in the quiet way that paperwork allows. 2:07, contact reported. 2:15 faded, escort investigated. No confirmation. He did not add speculation. Before dawn, at 4:10, the borrowed valve showed its first warning. The sweep brightness fluctuated briefly. The operator felt his stomach tighten, not from fear, but from the recognition of a pattern. He checked the cabinet temperature. He adjusted the brightness control, the sweep steadied again. He logged the fluctuation. 4:11, brief brightness fluctuation, recovered, monitor. It was micro foreshadowing of a narrowing margin, nothing more. At 5:30, the sky lightened. The second night ended without a clear engagement. That did not mean the danger was absent. It meant that the escort group had passed through a corridor without meeting the enemy. In the Arctic, many nights were like that. Most effort went into preventing contact, not winning set-piece battles. When the convoy finally reached safer waters days later, the escort put into a British anchorage for fuel and stores. In port, the radar defect could be addressed properly. A stores clerk and an artificer opened the spare kit envelope under better light. They confirmed the mismatch. The wrong valve type had been packed, perhaps at a depot far from the sea. No one in the depot had seen the ship's radar cabinet. The system depended on labels. A label had failed. The ship submitted a defect report through the established forms. The report carried the times. Attached to it was the mispacked envelope. A separate sheet held the note about the borrowed valve. No claims of saved ships were made. None were needed. Supply officers could act on the concrete facts. A replacement valve arrived with the next issue. The correct type was verified against the booklet before it was stored. The auxiliary set was restored to full lineup. The failed valve was kept for inspection and then discarded. A small stamp on the paperwork indicated that the depot had been notified. The quiet legacy was procedural. On that escort, and later in others within the group, the radar watch began a new habit. Spare envelopes were checked against the sets list at the start of each voyage. Valve numbers were written in pencil on the outside of the cabinet for quick reference. A short calibration note with time and short-range marks became routine after any maintenance, even temporary. No official history would mention those habits. They did not look like victories. For the radar operator, there was no medal and no citation. There was a brief word from a petty officer. Good work keeping it running. There was also a reminder from the engineer. Record everything. That was how small lessons entered the system. They entered through logs, not speeches. In the Arctic War, many lives depended on grand strategy and on the decisions of admirals. They also depended on minor components, mispacked envelopes, and men who could make careful choices under pressure without exaggerating what they had done. On one escort in 1944, a cracked valve had turned a screen dark at 23:07. A borrowed spare had brought it back by 23:45. The proof remained in ink, a defect entry, a tagged envelope, and a calibration note with time and range marks. If more overlooked wartime procedures and the people who kept them working deserve attention, consider subscribing for future episodes.